The lie of their 10th anniversary was served on a plate of brushed gold. It tasted of fennel foam and a vague metallic bitterness that Catherine Kate Bishop couldn't quite place. She watched her husband, Robert, swirl the ruby contents of his wineglass, the crystal catching the low, intimate light of the restaurant. He looked magnificent, a man carved from success. His suit was a deep charcoal, tailored to perfection, his silvering temples adding a touch of distinguished gravity. He was a performance, and tonight he was giving it his all. "Can you believe it, Kate?" 10 years, Rob said, his voice a low, practiced murmur. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His skin was cool, his touch a proprietary gesture she had long ago mistaken for affection. "Feels like yesterday we were just kids with a terrible apartment and a dream." Kate smiled, a careful arrangement of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. "It does." Their apartment hadn't been terrible, and the dream had been mostly his. She had been the supportive architecture, the scaffolding that allowed him to build his empire, Bishop Consulting. An empire she was supposed to be queen of, but lately felt more like a prisoner in. The restaurant, Aria, was the latest and grandest gesture in a year of hollow offerings. Located on the 95th floor of a Chicago skyscraper, it was a whisper on the lips of the city's elite, its waiting list a thing of legend. Getting a reservation was like securing a papal audience. When Rob had told her he'd pulled strings, she had felt a flicker of the old warmth. Maybe he was trying. Maybe the distance that had grown between them was something he finally wanted to bridge. But as he navigated the hushed, carpeted dining room, his confidence was unsettling. He didn't just walk to their table. He glided, greeting the maitre d', not with the polite deference of a new guest, but with the familiar nod of a regular. "Marco, good to see you," he'd said, and Marco had inclined his head in return. "Mr. Bishop, always a pleasure." He pointed out the details to her, with an air of ownership. "They sourced this marble from a single quarry in Italy," he mentioned, gesturing to the monolithic bar. "And the artist who did that piece over there is a client." He was showcasing his domain, and Kate felt a growing, sickening suspicion that it was the first time she'd been invited inside. She pushed the feeling down, labeling it as the cynicism that had become her constant companion. She wanted to believe him. Forcing herself to, she focused on the panoramic view of the city, a glittering tapestry of light spread out below them. A man in a sommelier's pristine black uniform approached their table with the silent grace of a predator. He was tall, with a kind, professional face. A small engraved pin on his lapel read Pierre. "Mr. Bishop, a pleasure. A special occasion this evening?" Pierre's voice was smooth, with a faint, unplaceable European accent. Rob puffed his chest out, a subtle, peacocking motion Kate knew well. "Our 10th anniversary." He gestured toward her. "My wife, Catherine." Pierre's eyes met Kate's, and he offered a respectful nod. The smile on his face was genuine. He then turned back to Rob, the easy familiarity returning to his expression, the kind reserved for a valued and well-known patron. "Wonderful," he said, his tone warm. "In that case, shall I bring your usual to celebrate? The 82 Lafitte you and Ms. Reed enjoyed so much last week?" The world did not stop. It fractured. The sound of the restaurant, the clink of silverware, the murmur of distant conversations, the soft jazz trio, all faded into a deafening roar inside Kate's head. Every nerve ending went cold. The name echoed in the sudden, silent cavern of her mind. Ms. Reed. Evelyn Reed. His new, ambitious senior analyst from Sterling Group. The one he'd mentioned was a real killer in the boardroom, the one he'd been traveling with for the last 6 months. Last week, he had told her he was in San Francisco, closing a deal. Kate felt Rob's hand flinch under hers. A small, convulsive movement that told her everything. She watched, with a strange sense of detachment, as the blood drained from his face. His confident smile froze, a grotesque rictus of panic. He was a statue, a monument to his own deceit, shattered by a single polite question. Pierre, oblivious, waited with a pleasant, expectant look. He had not made an error. He had simply followed a script Rob had written for him over countless clandestine evenings. In that frozen moment, Kate had a choice. She could scream. She could stand up and overturn the table, shattering the crystal and the carefully constructed illusion of their life. She could expose him right here, in his sanctuary of lies, in front of all these powerful people. The impulse was a hot, violent surge in her chest. But then, a different instinct, colder and far more lethal, took its place. She felt it rise from the ashes of her broken heart. A glacial, crystalline resolve. An explosion would be messy. It would give him the satisfaction of her pain. No, a slow, methodical demolition was what he deserved. She would not be a victim in his story. She would be the architect of his ruin. She slowly drew her hand back from his. She looked up at Pierre, her expression serene, her smile a masterpiece of control. "An 82 Lafitte?" she said, her voice impossibly steady. "My husband has such exquisite taste. Yes, please, we'll have a bottle." Pierre bowed his head slightly, the professional in him missing the subatomic explosion that had just occurred. "An excellent choice, Mrs. Bishop. I shall decant it for you at once." As he turned and walked away, the silence he left behind was thick and suffocating. Kate watched Rob, not with the fury of a betrayed wife, but with the detached curiosity of a biologist observing a specimen under a microscope. His composure was gone, replaced by a sheen of cold sweat on his forehead. He opened his mouth, then closed it, the gears of his mind grinding audibly as he tried to construct a lie monumental enough to plaster over the gaping chasm that had just opened in their lives. "Kate, he began, his voice a strangled whisper. "That was a misunderstanding." Kate didn't allow him to finish. She picked up her water glass, her movements fluid and unhurried, and took a small, deliberate sip. She set it down without a sound. "Don't be silly, Robert," she said, her tone light, almost conversational. It was the voice she used with difficult clients, a placid surface over a core of unyielding steel. "There's no misunderstanding." Relief flickered in his eyes, a desperate hope that she had somehow not understood the implication. She let him cling to it for a moment before she twisted the knife. "Evelyn Reed, from Sterling Group, right? The analyst you said was a real shark?" She smiled again, a bright social thing that was utterly terrifying. "How lovely that you two have similar tastes in wine. Is she a connoisseur as well? You must have so much to talk about on those long business trips." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart. She saw them land, saw the small winces, the tightening of his jaw. He was scrambling, his mind a panicked flurry of alibis and excuses. "She is. A client thing, you know. You have to entertain them. It's the cost of doing business." He was grabbing at straws, his explanation flimsy and insulting. "Of course," Kate said, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "You work so hard for us, darling. Taking clients to a place like this, drinking $1,000 wine. It must be exhausting. I'm so glad you have someone like Evelyn to help you with that burden." He flinched as if struck. He was used to her quiet support, her unquestioning acceptance of his long hours and frequent travel. He was not prepared for this serene, smiling woman who wielded his own lies against him like a razor. This was not the Kate he had left at home. The woman sitting across from him was a stranger, and she was looking at him with eyes that held no warmth, only a chilling, calculating clarity. Pierre returned with the wine, a ritual of reverence. He presented the bottle to Rob, its label dark with age. "Chateau Lafite Rothschild, 1982. Rob could only nod, his throat working. Kate watched as Pierre uncorked the bottle, the faint pop sounding like a gunshot in the silent war between them. He poured a small amount into a glass for Rob to taste. Rob lifted it, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly. He brought it to his lips, his eyes darting to Kate, searching for a sign, a crack in her composure. He found none. He was alone in his panic. It's perfect, he managed to say. Pierre filled their glasses, the deep garnet liquid a symbol of the blood that had been spilled from their marriage. He retreated, and they were alone again. Kate raised her glass. To 10 years, Robert, she said, her voice a soft purr. And to all the things we've learned along the way. To honesty, to trust, and to fruitful business partnerships. He had no choice but to raise his own glass. Their crystal chimed, a funeral bell for their life together. He took a large swallow, as if trying to drown the truth. Kate, however, only touched the wine to her lips. She would not drink his poison. She would need a clear head for what was to come. She set the glass down and looked at him, her smile unwavering. The first course arrived, oysters on a bed of ice. Rob stared at them, his appetite gone. Kate, on the other hand, picked up the tiny fork. She squeezed a wedge of lemon over one, the sharp scent cutting through the air. She lifted it to her mouth and savored it, her gaze locked on her husband. It was a declaration. You will not ruin this meal for me. You will not ruin anything else. He watched her, a dawning horror in his eyes. This wasn't a fight he could win with blustering or denial. Her calm was more terrifying than any rage. He had brought her to the scene of his crime, and instead of recoiling in horror, she had pulled up a chair, ordered the most expensive thing on the menu, and was preparing to watch him burn. The evening he had orchestrated as a display of his power had become his public execution, and his wife, the woman he had so carelessly underestimated, was the one holding the axe. The rest of the meal passed in a state of suspended horror for Rob and calculated observation for Kate. She guided the conversation, a master puppeteer pulling at the strings of their shared history, peppering it with innocent questions that were laden with poison. "Remember that trip you took to the Caymans last spring for the banking conference?" she asked as she elegantly sliced into her filet mignon. "Was Evelyn with you on that trip? I imagine the networking opportunities must have been incredible." "No," he said too quickly. "That was a solo trip, just meetings." He was sweating now, despite the perfectly climate-controlled room. "A shame," Kate mused, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. It's always good to have a colleague to bounce ideas off, especially when dealing with complex financial instruments. Offshore accounts and the like can be so tricky, can't they? She was a surgeon, making precise incisions into his web of deceit. With every question, she was gathering data, confirming timelines, watching his reactions. His lies were clumsy, patched together with the desperation of a guilty man. After the main course was cleared, Kate placed her napkin on the table. "Excuse me for a moment," she said with a polite smile, rising from her chair. She didn't walk directly to the ladies' room. Instead, her path took her on a scenic route that passed near the Sommelier station, where Pierre was polishing glasses. As she approached, she swayed slightly, her hand flying to her temple in a gesture of delicate distress. "Oh my," she murmured, her voice just loud enough to catch his attention. Pierre was at her side in an instant, his professional concern evident. "Mrs. Bishop, are you all right? Can I get you some water?" She gave him a weak, grateful smile. "Thank you, Pierre. You're very kind. I think I may have just stood up too quickly. You must forgive me. Your wine recommendation just took my breath away." She leaned against the station slightly, creating an air of intimacy, of shared confidence. "My husband works so closely with Ms. Reed, but I've never had the pleasure of meeting her. Is she a regular here as well?" The question was delivered with the perfect blend of wifely pride and casual curiosity. It was flawless. Pierre's professional discretion was formidable, but the question was harmless on its surface. "Ms. Reed is an esteemed guest, yes," he confirmed with a polite, affirmative nod. "Mr. Bishop often hosts important business dinners here." "Of course he does. He's the most dedicated man I know," Kate said, her voice filled with a hollow admiration. The confirmation was all she needed. It wasn't a one-time thing. This was their place. She straightened up, her manufactured dizziness vanishing. "Thank you, Pierre. I feel much better now." She continued to the ladies' room, her heels clicking with renewed purpose on the marble floor. Inside the opulent, silent space, she leaned against the cool granite counter and looked at her reflection. The woman staring back was pale, her eyes burning with an intensity she hadn't seen in years. The shock had receded, leaving behind a diamond-hard certainty. This was not just an affair. Rob was not a simple cheat. He was a conspirator, and Evelyn Reed was his partner. The talk of offshore accounts, the trips to the Caymans, it was all beginning to coalesce into a much uglier picture. This went beyond infidelity. This was about their assets, her future. Returning to the table, she found Rob nursing a whiskey, his face grim. He looked up as she sat down, a desperate, pleading look in his eyes. He was hoping she had returned with forgiveness, or at least a manageable level of anger. He was about to be sorely disappointed. Kate settled back into her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know," she began, her voice calm and even, "I was just thinking about my old college roommate, Sarah. Her husband had an affair a few years back. It was a terrible mess." Rob stiffened. "Kate, I don't think—" "No, it's a fascinating story, really," she interrupted smoothly, her gaze fixed on him. "He was very clever, you see. He thought he had everything covered. He and his mistress, she was his CFO. Can you imagine the nerve? Started a shell company. He was slowly moving their marital assets into it, planning to leave Sarah with nothing but the house and a mountain of debt." She paused to sip her water, letting the words hang in the air between them. Rob's hand, holding the whiskey glass, began to tremble. "But they got sloppy," Kate continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "He used company funds for a trip. She bought a car with money from an account he'd funded. Small things. But Sarah's lawyer was brilliant. She didn't just file for divorce. She found the paper trail. It turned out what he was doing wasn't just immoral, it was illegal. Wire fraud, the lawyer called it. Tax evasion. The SEC got involved." She leaned forward, her eyes boring into his. "In the end, he gave Sarah everything, the house, the business, his pension, just to make her sign an NDA and avoid a federal investigation. He lost it all, his reputation, his career, his freedom, all for a woman who left him the moment the money was gone." She leaned back, her story finished. The silence that followed was absolute. She didn't have to accuse him. She had simply shown him his own future. She watched the color drain from his face, the realization dawning in his eyes that he had not just been caught in a lie, but in a crime. And his quiet, accommodating wife knew exactly what to call it. The dessert menus arrived, thick, leather-bound books filled with confections that now seemed obscene. Rob waved the waiter away with a curt shake of his head. He was done pretending. The story had landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs and the lies from his lips. He was pale and visibly unnerved, his eyes darting around the restaurant as if the walls were closing in. Kate's calculated psychological assault had worked better than she could have imagined. She had planted the seeds of legal terror in his mind, and they were taking root in fertile, guilty soil. "Excuse me for a moment," he muttered, his voice hoarse. He pushed his chair back abruptly, the legs scraping against the floor. He wasn't going to make a call. He was fleeing. He needed air, needed a moment away from her chillingly calm gaze to reassemble his shattered composure. In his panic, he made a simple, fatal error. He stood up and, without a second thought, left his phone on the table, face down on the white linen next to his plate. It was a common act of carelessness, the kind of mistake a man makes when his mind is screaming, a mistake born not of stupidity, but of sheer terror. The moment he was out of sight, heading towards the men's room, a profound stillness settled over Kate. Her own panic, the wild, frantic bird that had been beating against her ribs, fell silent. Her training, years of hosting charity galas, of managing difficult board members, of presenting a flawless facade to the world, took over. Her hands were perfectly steady. She knew his passcode. It was pathetic, really. 1 to 9, C8. 8. The year his college football team had won the state championship. A small, sad monument to a time when he believed he was a hero. He had never bothered to change it, confident in its obscurity, underestimating her observant nature. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silent dining room. With a quick glance around to ensure no waiters were approaching, she picked up the phone. The cool, smooth glass felt like a weapon in her hand. Her thumb hovered over the screen. This was the precipice. Once she crossed it, there was no going back. She pressed the home button. The screen lit up. She entered the code. 1988. Click. The phone unlocked. Her breath hitched. She was in. She ignored the texts, the emails. Her instincts, honed to a razor's edge over the last hour, guided her. Calendar. Her finger tapped the icon. The screen filled with his meticulously organized life. Meetings, conference calls, reminders. Her eyes scanned quickly, moving past entries like dentist and quarterly review. She jumped forward a day, and then she saw it. There, on the next day's schedule, was an entry for 10 a.m. The title was stark, clinical, and utterly damning. RB, final transfer. Evelyn Reed. RB, Robert Bishop, final transfer. The words slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just an affair. It was an exit strategy. He was looting their life, and tomorrow morning was the final withdrawal. The story she had invented about her friend Sarah wasn't a parable. It was a prophecy. Her mind raced. She needed proof, something she could take with her. Fumbling for a moment, she pulled her own phone from her clutch. Her fingers shook slightly now as she unlocked it and opened the camera. She held it over his phone, centering the calendar entry in the frame. The light was low, but her screen was bright. She held her breath, steadying her hand. Click. The soft, digital sound of the shutter was the loudest noise she had ever heard. She had it. A clear, undeniable photograph of his plan. The evidence. With methodical precision, she locked his phone and placed it back on the table, face down, in the exact same position it had been. She slipped her own phone back into her purse. She smoothed her dress, folded her hands in her lap, and took a deep, steadying breath. Seconds later, Rob returned to the table. His face was still ashen, but he had managed to paste on a semblance of control. He sat down, avoiding her eyes, completely unaware that his entire secret life now resided in a single image in his wife's handbag. He had walked away from the table, a man with a dangerous secret. He returned a man whose fate had already been sealed. Kate allowed the silence to stretch for another minute, watching Rob pick up his whiskey and drain the glass in one desperate gulp. The bravado was gone, replaced by the haunted look of a cornered animal. It was time to end this charade. She pressed her fingertips to her temple, feigning a sudden wave of pain. "Robert," she said, her voice soft but strained, "I have a terrible migraine coming on. The lights, the noise. It's all a bit much." He latched onto the excuse with pathetic gratitude. It was a way out, an end to this excruciating evening. "Of course, Kate. Of course. We can go. I'll get the check." "No, you stay and settle up," she insisted, already gathering her clutch. "I just need some air. I'll wait for you in the lobby downstairs." It was the perfect excuse. It got her away from him, gave her privacy and a head start. Before he could object, she was on her feet and walking away, her posture erect, her stride purposeful. She didn't look back. The elevator ride down from the 95th floor felt like a descent into a new reality. The mirrored walls reflected a woman she barely recognized, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with a cold fire. When the doors opened into the grand, quiet lobby of the skyscraper, she didn't stop. She walked past the security desk, past the enormous, abstract sculpture in the center of the atrium, and found a secluded alcove with a leather bench, hidden from the main entrance. She sank onto the bench, her bag in her lap. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline of the last hour flooding her system. She took one more deep breath, then pulled out her phone. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb stopping on a single name: Maria Sanchez, her best friend since law school, now one of the most feared divorce attorneys in Chicago. She pressed the call button. It rang twice. "Kate, is everything okay?" Maria's voice was sharp, instantly alert. It was after 10 on a weeknight. She knew this wasn't a social call. "No," Kate said, her voice a hushed, urgent whisper. "It's happening. It's real." There was a pause on the other end, then the sound of a television being muted. "Okay," Maria said, her tone shifting from concerned friend to focused litigator. "Tell me everything. Where are you?" "Aria. He brought me to Aria for our anniversary," Kate said, the absurdity of it catching in her throat. "Maria, this is their place." "Their place?" "His and Evelyn Reed's," Kate confirmed, the name tasting like ash. She quickly recounted the sommelier's slip, Rob's reaction, the story she'd told, and the final damning piece of evidence. "I have a photo from his calendar. An entry for tomorrow morning at 10. It says, ERRB, final transfer. I need you to find it, Maria. I need you to find it before he can complete that transfer." She could hear the faint sound of typing on the other end of the line. Maria was already working. "Evelyn Reed, Sterling Group. Got it. ERRB. He's arrogant. He's using their initials. Okay, Kate. I'm going to run a search for any LLCs registered with those initials. I'll start with Delaware. It's the usual suspect for shell corporations. The Cayman account you mentioned from his trip, that's the funding source. This is textbook, Kate. He's not as smart as he thinks he is." "What do I do now?" Kate asked, feeling a tremor of fear. "You do nothing." Maria's voice was firm, commanding. "You go home. You get in your bed, and you pretend to have the worst migraine of your life. Don't speak to him. Don't accuse him. Don't let him know you know anything more than what the sommelier said. We need him to feel safe until I can get a judge to sign an injunction freezing that account tomorrow morning. Can you do that?" "Yes," Kate whispered. "I can do that." "Good. I'll work all night if I have to. I'll have answers for you before you wake up. Stay strong." As Kate hung up, she saw the elevator doors across the lobby open. Rob stepped out, his face a mask of anxiety as he scanned the cavernous space, looking for her. She quickly slipped her phone back into her purse and stood up, composing her features into a mask of pained exhaustion. She walked towards him, her steps measured. "There you are," he said, his voice tight with false concern. "I was worried." "Just needed to get away from the noise," she said, her voice weak. She allowed her body to sag slightly, leaning on his arm as they walked toward the exit. The gesture was a lie, a piece of theater. She wasn't leaning on him for support. She was a predator, steadying herself before the final kill. And he, wrapped up in his own guilt and fear, suspected nothing. The drive home was 20 minutes of the loudest silence Kate had ever experienced. The interior of the Mercedes was a vacuum, sucking all the air and warmth out of the space between them. Rob gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles stark white under the intermittent glow of the streetlights. He kept glancing at her, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. What could he say? The lies he had prepared were for a different kind of confrontation, for tears and accusations, not this glacial, unnerving calm. Kate stared out her window, watching the familiar Chicago skyline slide past. The glittering towers, once symbols of the life they had built, now looked like jagged shards of glass. Each light was a reminder of a dinner party she had hosted, a client she had charmed, an evening she had spent alone while he was working late. Her entire life felt like a fraud, and the man responsible was sitting 2 feet away, radiating a toxic mix of guilt and fear. She felt her phone vibrate in her purse. A text message. She knew, with absolute certainty, who it was from. Her heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. She waited until they were stopped at a red light before she discreetly pulled it out, angling the screen away from him. It was from Maria. The message was short, but it was a declaration of total victory. "Got it. ER Capital, LLC. Registered in Delaware 3 months ago. Funded from a Cayman account he opened 6 months ago. He's been bleeding your marital assets in small, regular transfers to avoid detection. I have the wire logs. The final transfer tomorrow was for the remaining 7 figures in your joint investment portfolio. He's cornered Kate. I have everything. Kate read the message twice. A wave of cold, clarifying rage washed through her, sweeping away the last remnants of her grief. He hadn't just been cheating. He had been systematically erasing her from their financial life, planning to leave her with an empty shell. The anniversary dinner wasn't a peace offering. It was a final, arrogant flourish before disappearing. The light turned green. Rob accelerated, the car gliding silently through the sleeping streets of their Lincoln Park neighborhood. As they turned onto their own tree-lined block, the sight of their beautiful, sprawling brownstone filled Kate with a new, possessive anger. He was not going to take this from her. He was not going to take anything else. He pulled into the driveway, the engine humming to a stop. The silence returned, heavier than before. This was it. The end of the performance. Before he could cut the engine, before they could step out of the car and back into the lie of their home, Kate turned to him. Her face was calm, her voice devoid of any emotion. It was a terrifyingly neutral tone, the voice of a judge about to pass sentence. I was just thinking, she said, her words cutting cleanly through the tension. That final transfer tomorrow morning. Rob froze, his hand hovering over the ignition button. He slowly turned his head to look at her, his eyes wide with disbelief and dawning horror. The specificity of her words, the name she couldn't possibly know, hit him with the force of a physical blow. Kate's gaze was unwavering. Was that going to be the last of our money before you left? Or just the last of it before you asked me for a divorce? He didn't answer. He couldn't. The carefully constructed walls of his double life came crashing down around him in the suffocating confines of the car. There was no denial, no blustering, no possible lie that could cover this. She knew. He didn't know how she knew, but the calm certainty in her voice told him it was absolute. He just stared ahead, through the windshield, at the warm, inviting lights of the home he was about to lose. His grip on the steering wheel tightened until his fingers ached. His silence was his confession. It was a complete, unconditional surrender. The war was over before he even realized she had been fighting. Let's go inside, Kate said, her voice still unnervingly flat. We have things to discuss. She opened her car door, the sound echoing in the quiet night like the closing of a tomb. The walk from the garage to the kitchen was the longest of Robert's life. He followed Kate like a man being led to the gallows, each step an affirmation of his doom. The house, his castle, felt alien and hostile. Every polished surface, every piece of art she had chosen, seemed to mock him. Kate didn't stop in the kitchen. She walked with a purpose he had never seen before, straight down the hall to the heart of his empire, his mahogany-paneled study. It was his sanctuary, the one room in the house that was entirely his. Tonight, it would be his courtroom. She didn't bother with his locked file cabinets or his personal safe. She walked directly to the printer connected to her laptop, which she'd retrieved from the living room. She tapped a few keys. The machine whirred to life, spitting out page after page of his crimes. Bank statements from the Cayman Islands, wire transfer logs, the articles of incorporation for ER Capital, LLC. Maria had sent the entire damning file. Rob watched, paralyzed, as the tangible proof of his betrayal piled up in the printer tray. It was impossible. It was supposed to be untraceable, buried under layers of legal firewalls. Kate collected the still warm pages, squared them when he finally ran out of breath, his chest heaving. She spoke again, her voice as cold and hard as the documents on his desk. Are you finished? He stared at her, his rage deflating into a pathetic whimper. He began to plead. Kate, please, we can fix this. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. It was the pressure. I never meant to hurt you. You meant to beggar me, she corrected him, her voice merciless. You meant to steal the life I helped you build and leave me with nothing. That isn't a mistake. That's a plan. She reached into her purse and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper, a separation agreement that Maria had emailed her just before they'd arrived home. She placed it on top of the pile of evidence. "Here are my terms," she stated. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a decree. "The house is mine, free and clear. You will be out by the end of the week. I get 70% of all remaining liquid assets, including your personal accounts and stock portfolio. Your ownership of Bishop Consulting, which was built with our joint capital for the last decade, will be signed over to me in its entirety." He looked at her as if she were insane. "My company? You want my company? That's everything. That's my life." "It was our life," she corrected him again. "And now it's my compensation for your attempt to defraud me." He laughed, a raw, hysterical sound. "You can't be serious. No judge would ever grant that. I'll fight you. I'll drag this out for years." Kate didn't flinch. "You won't fight me, Robert. Because if you do not sign this agreement by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, a copy of this entire file," she tapped the pile of evidence, "goes to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the IRS, and every single one of your clients. They might be interested to learn how their trusted financial advisor funnels money through illegal offshore shell corporations. Wire fraud carries a sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison. Is your company worth that to you?" The heir left the room. He stared at the documents, then at her face. He saw no mercy there, no hint of bluff. He saw only the cold, hard reality of his choices. His ambition, the very trait he had accused her of lacking, the justification for his betrayal, was now the leverage she was using to utterly destroy him. He was trapped between two impossible options: complete financial and professional annihilation at her hands, or a slightly slower, more public ruin at the hands of the federal government. He sank into his desk chair, the fight draining out of him. He was no longer a master of the universe. He was just a man in a cage of his own making, and his wife held the only key. He looked at the woman he had dismissed as a decorative, supportive part of his life, and for the first time, he saw her clearly. And she was terrifying. 6 months later, the view from the 95th floor was just as breathtaking, but the woman admiring it was entirely different. Catherine Bishop stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of what was now the central boardroom of Bishop and Associates. The name was a temporary concession, a bridge to maintain client confidence during the transition. Soon, it would bear her name alone. She wore a charcoal gray suit that was every bit as sharp as the one Robert had worn, but on her, it looked like armor she had forged herself. She turned from the window and walked to the head of the long mahogany table. "So, to summarize," she said, her voice confident and clear, resonating with an authority that was now second nature. "The acquisition of the sterling portfolio is complete. Projections for the next quarter are up 12%. Any further questions?" The board members, a mix of old faces who had chosen to stay and new ones she had brought in, looked at her with a uniform expression of respect. There were no questions. Her command of the details was absolute. "Excellent," she said with a crisp nod. "Meeting adjourned." As the room cleared, Kate remained, gazing down at the city. She had discovered, in the wreckage of her marriage, a formidable business acumen she had long suppressed to avoid outshining her husband. She was ruthless, intuitive, and a brilliant strategist. Robert had built the company's foundation, but she was building its future, and it was stronger and more ethical than he could have ever imagined. The fates of the other players in her drama had been swift and brutal. Robert had signed the papers. He had chosen capitulation over prison. Stripped of his company, his home, and the bulk of his wealth, his name became toxic in the tight-knit world of Chicago finance. The vague, sanitized story was that he'd had a breakdown, and Kate had stepped in to save the firm. The truth, whispered in back rooms and over expensive lunches, was far more damning. He now worked a low-level consulting job for a suburban firm, a bitter, diminished ghost haunting the fringes of the world he once dominated. He was a man who had lost his entire identity because it had only ever been built on money and status. Evelyn Reed's ambition had been her undoing. The ER in ER Capital made her complicity undeniable. When the truth of the attempted fraud became a quiet but persistent rumor, Sterling Group cut her loose to avoid the taint of scandal. Her partnership with Robert dissolved into a flurry of bitter, screamed accusations, each blaming the other for the spectacular failure of their plan. Her career, once a soaring rocket, had crashed back to earth, leaving nothing but scorched ground. Kate's phone buzzed on the polished table. A text message from Maria. "It's done. Judge signed off this morning. You're officially free. Dinner tonight to celebrate? My treat." A slow, genuine smile spread across Kate's face. It reached her eyes, lighting them with a warmth that had been absent for years. It was a smile of relief, of victory, of pure, unburdened liberation. The last legal tie to Robert was severed. The past was no longer a weight, but a closed account. She typed back a reply. "Absolutely. See you at 8. Then, with a sense of finality, she opened her contacts. She scrolled to his name, Robert Bishop. For a moment, she looked at the name and the number that had once been the center of her universe. She felt no anger, no sadness. She felt nothing at all. He was simply a line item on a ledger that was now closed. She pressed and held the contact, and then tapped the option that appeared on the screen. Delete. The name vanished. Catherine Bishop took a deep breath, the clean, conditioned air of her office filling her lungs. She looked out at the vast, sprawling city, at the endless horizon over Lake Michigan. It wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. The future was hers to write, and for the first time in a decade, the page was gloriously, wonderfully blank. She turned from the window and walked back to her desk. There was work to be
And
done.
that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.